Hey, what's up, guys? It's Lax here for Sunrise Gaming. Recently, I've been playing the game Escape from Tarkov, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. Essentially, Escape from Tarkov is a looter shooter that is kind of akin to DayZ, however, it's in its own class and it has its own unique design. Escape from Tarkov, at its very core, is very simple. You load into a raid on a set map and you try to traverse the raid, gathering resources, items, gear, and you try to extract from that raid to keep everything that you brought in and that you found in the raid. If you die during the raid, then you lose everything that you brought in. You go against AI as well as other players. I think this game is beautiful. I think it's one of the most premier FPS out there. Its animations are slick and clean. The combat is great, rewarding and challenging at the same time. The brutalness of having to keep up with your health as well as any sort of other details that you have to manage, whether you're dehydrated, whether you have a broken bone, those types of things adds to the realism that Tarkov pushes, but still keeps it at a video game level, and it equals out to one of the best rushes you'll ever get when you're playing the game. I think it's greatly designed. However, I do think there is a fundamental problem to the design of Escape from Tarkov. And it is the primary thing I think holding this game back from being the premier FPS that everybody wants to play. Now, I want to clarify. I am going to be taking this position on this problem from a casual's point of view. The reason is because I work a lot. I work a lot outside of my video game time, and even though I mainly only have a few hours at night to play, I want to play rewarding and challenging games, and I think that's where Tarkov right is. A lot of people like to argue that Tarkov isn't for casuals. I would disagree and say that it absolutely is. However, it can be tweaked and improved upon in order to encompass a wide variety of players and play styles. Okay, before we move on to the actual problem, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of challenge versus progression. As seen here in this graph, we're going to be graphing challenge versus progression. Now, I want to define our terms here first. Progression and challenge are going to be broad in their design. Progression meaning time spent, the working through the different levels of the game, leveling up your own character, getting better gear, anything that progresses your gameplay further. In Tarkov, that would be getting better games, or I'm sorry, getting better guns, not better games. Getting better guns, getting better skills. There is a skill system in the game, so improving your skills, improving your overall level, which unlocks certain quests and items that you can buy from vendors, so on and so forth. Progression being as you progress through the game. How does it change? Now, the challenge. Challenge being how difficult is the game? Does the game impose certain things on you that allows you to feel challenged, and when you overcome that challenge you get a sense of reward? Is the reward right? If I spend 10 hours doing a quest and I get a mediocre reward, that's not a right challenge. So challenge versus progression is one of the most fundamental things in the gaming industry. When we look at most standard games, it follows a linear pathway up. As you progress throughout the game gets more challenging. If the challenge of the game does not change, then there's no point in playing. At some point, you get so good that it's not even fun trying. Think of using exploits in Skyrim. Certain exploits are absolutely fine, but once you get to level 100 and you go into the system and you change all your skills to crazy proportions, it's not really that fun. It's fun for a little bit, but you don't want to play the game for that reason. Some of the games that I think does this really well would be like WoW Classic or Dark Souls. In both those games, the challenge is there constantly, but it gets harder and harder as you go. You get better and better gear in Classic, you level up, but you start fighting harder and harder enemies. The quests start to get a little bit more difficult, and towards the end game, you're doing raids, doing harder dungeons, and so forth. Same thing with Dark Souls. It follows a linear path where the challenge is constant, even with the progression. You feel stronger because you're taking on stronger enemies. You feel stronger because you're able to do things a little quicker. You're able to see maybe numbers on the screen that shows you're hitting harder. That is a feedback mechanism that tells the gamer that they are being challenged and that they are getting stronger, which is what we like to see. It's a sense of escapism. So, in general, games must be challenging, which are accomplished in different ways in order to keep interest. How you get challenged completely varies by the type of game. Platformers, the basic Mario games, as you progress and your own skill gets better, the levels get harder. So a player skill is also part of progression. Now, relating this to Tarkov. Tarkov is very challenging. It starts out on the challenge aspect a lot higher than other games. When you first load into your first raid, you're likely not going to survive because you just don't know what you're doing. And that's fine. I don't think that's inherent to the problem. It's a very challenging game, and once you start to overcome those challenges, is when the game starts to get super rewarding. There are some other problems in the game that I'm not going to touch on because I believe the problem that I want to introduce is the root of all these problems. I do think the root of all these problems has to relate to the challenge versus progression hypothesis here. Now, moving on to my hypothesis. This is what I think Tarkov looks like. I believe that the challenge in Tarkov starts out really, really high and diminishes as you progress. This is not rewarding. Now, I'm not going to argue that there aren't mechanisms in this game that increase that challenge or that challenge you back as you progress. But think about when you first started going into raids versus the last couple raids you did before a wipe happens. It got a lot easier. Your survival rate probably increased. I can't say the same because I'm pretty bad at the game and I have a pretty standard, terrible survival rate, but regardless. Now, why is it like this? Well, map knowledge is extremely important to the game. Map knowledge is probably the biggest skill you need to know. If I don't know where I'm going and I don't know all the ins and outs, I'm going to get pinned down and shot by somebody that knows better. Item knowledge is very important. A lot of this game, once you get to level 10, is funded by the flea market. You're able to buy weapons and attachments and things that make your life a little bit easier. However, if you don't have good knowledge of the items, you don't know what sells that well, you just try to pack everything in your bags, you could be missing out on a lot of money. And for a newer player that hasn't had a lot of time to learn, that can be devastating when you don't have a large stash value at the beginning. The player base has already learned so much. The player base is extremely loyal to this game, if you've noticed. And so whenever a new player loads in, they're already at a disadvantage because the rest of the player base knows the maps, the items way better. And when you, generally speaking, when you buy a new game, you're probably going to try it out solo. Your first raid is probably not going to be with other players. And if you're constantly losing while you're playing solo, you're less likely to keep playing. Why would I recommend a game to a friend that I constantly lose at? Now, with all that being said, I'm not saying that we should reduce the difficulty or we should change this challenge section here. I'm not going to argue that. I do think the challenge is appropriate, and I do think the design and the problems that I mentioned previously are not necessarily that bad. You can't do anything about map knowledge if the game is so reliant upon it. You can't do anything if the player base has already learned so much. You just can't. That's essentially a good thing. That means that the game was designed for people to keep playing, and that's good. However, this is a problem because maps, looting, and combat all get easier over time, and there's nothing to make it harder. Now, I'm going to put nothing there in quotes because there are elements to this game that do make it a little bit harder. But this is the overall problem that I think exists. Now, it's more likely something like this. This is probably more accurate that the challenge does increase a little bit as you start to play, as you learn new maps and you start to get a hang on things. You're starting to realize that it's a lot more brutal than it really makes it out to be. Instead of just trying to go from where you load into the extraction point, you're exploring more of the maps, and that leads to more challenging fights and whatnot. However, it essentially follows the same pattern. Now, there are counterpoints to this, obviously. The quests. The quests do offer a challenge. They offer not only a challenge for players at the late game, but they also offer direction for earlier players. Now, I think the quests can be tweaked. I really like where they are. I will say quests are my favorite thing to do in this game. They sort of give me a direction coming from, a player that's extremely casual that only has a couple hours to play at night, if I can knock out 2 or 3 quests, I'm happy. So that's good. Now, there are also different ways to play the game. Not everybody loads into a map and plays the game the exact same way. Obviously, there's the rat versus Chad dynamic, but without going into that, a lot of players will run lower gear purposefully in order to make out with more money, more profit, and whatnot. And that happens at every rank. I've run into raids with only a Mosin just trying to complete a quest, and that's fine. That's fun for me, and I think it'll be fun for a lot of the player base running in and kind of challenging yourself. Obviously, labs are also a challenge. It has the best gear, so a lot of people want to go to labs. Uh, Putting the cheater point and the hacking point aside, labs is designed to be that challenge for those at the end. However, with these counterpoints that I've laid out, they don't reflect the core of the game. The core of the game is loading into a map, killing, looting, running around the map, and getting out. With that being said, with that as the core of the game, it follows this challenge versus progression dynamic. If you take out quests, if you take out labs, if you take out the community consensus that you have to run certain gear in order to maximize profit, yada, yada, yada. If you take that out and you're just looking at the core of the game gets less challenging as you play it. Now, I will say, those that have a lot of time to play and they get really good, they feel, because the game is so brutal, when you survive more and more raids, you feel good about that, obviously. So players that play a lot and they just shit on other players and they have a really high survival rate, they're going to feel really good. And I will say that is a point in favor, or I guess technically a point against the problem that I've laid out. However, that doesn't take away from the core design of the game being it gets easier as you play it and you don't get challenged back. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because Tarkov is arguably one of the best games out there right now. However, this game hurts casual players. Now, let me define casual. A lot of people like to think that casual players don't want to play hardcore games. They don't want to play games where they have to think a lot. They don't want to play games where they have to put a lot of time in before they actually play the game and get better. Watching YouTube videos on how to, run customs and how to effectively get, profit from interchange or reserve. I would disagree. Casual player is simply somebody who only has a few hours to play at night, maybe less than that. Maybe on the weekends they get to have a nice 8 to 10 hour gaming session. And I'm speaking from that perspective as well. The preference of that player's game is up to that player. I think you can be a casual player and enjoy hardcore games at the same time. Now, this is where I believe that the problem is actually going to hurt the game in the long run. You have to have a growing base, since it looks like Battlestate Games doesn't want to introduce any sort of like cosmetic store where there's some sort of paying money to get cosmetics and whatnot. And they also don't want to run a subscription. Now, those are fine things. I think that's a great decision to make for your game. But if you're not going to run subscriptions and you're not going to run some sort of real money store, you really need casuals to keep buying the game, and you need that game, that player base to grow over time. Now, why do I think this hurts casuals? Well, there is less time to learn and get better. At the beginning of a wipe, we all start at level 1. I'm not going to get to level 10 till a couple days, whereas somebody who plays 8 hours a day can get to level 10 in a couple hours. And this leads to unfair fights. Now, I know I just said the word unfair, and the fanboys of Tarkov do not want to hear the word unfair. The game is supposed to be challenging. The game is supposed to be unfair. You're supposed to load into a raid and not know what you're going to go up against. I completely agree. I'm not saying that that is the only thing that makes this a problem. I don't have a problem going into a raid and there being unfair fights. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. The problem is not unfair fights. The problem is that nobody gets challenged. And if you're constantly going to get shit on, because the higher player base isn't getting challenged correctly, then you're less likely to play the game. That's just how it is. And if the response to that is, oh, well, we don't want you if you're not going to try to grind to get through it, okay, that's fine. I understand where you're coming from. I'm just saying that if the casual player base doesn't want to play the game because it takes so long to learn and it leads to unfair situations, you can't blame them, and you can't blame them for why Tarkov might fail eventually. Moving on. Losing more often costs losing more often early on costs more money. You can't get better gear and items to make fights easier. So a new player that just started the game is going to lose a lot. Trying to get items back through insurance, trying to pay for new guns to make things easier is going to cost you money, and your stash value is going to go down. At some point, you're going to be very little money, very little items, and you're just going to be like, what the heck? I know this happened to me early on, and obviously there are ways to make that easier. However, it is a factor that adds to this problem. Casuals won't want to spend more money to get better starting spot on the game. Currently, you can buy a standard game for I think like $45. You get the smallest stash size and the smallest secure container to start with, and the smallest amount of items that you start out with. But nobody wants to pay, I think it's like $140 for uh, the most premier version of the game if you haven't played it. So casual's going to pay $45. They're going to have the worst starting position. They're going to have less time to learn and get better. They're going to lose more money early on. And they can't even mitigate that with a better stash size or a larger container to try to, hold on to their meds, or, make out with items that will actually give them money. Casuals probably start the game solo. When you're playing this game, another problem that is essentially inherent to the design, and there's really no way to mitigate this without destroying the integrity of the game. You almost always start a new game solo. And then if you like it, you tell your friends and you try to form a group. Or you tell your friends and you're like, oh, they play the game too, let's play together. If you're a casual player and you're starting out solo, the game is already unbalanced against you. You are more likely to load into a raid with other players that are in groups, which is going to make taking those fights harder. And because it takes more time for you to learn and get better, because you're not going to have great gear early on and you're not going to have a lot of money to pay for better gear, then you're not going to be able to effectively take those fights. You may get lucky, and that's a great thing. Now, why am I saying all this? Well, because I really do think you want casuals, as I mentioned previously. Casuals keeps the game alive. A larger audience for content creators as well. Tarkov has some of the best, most in-depth guides I've ever seen, and they're plenty. People that have so many hours in the game really taking the time to go through and making guides that are effective. But if you take away the casuals, you're not going to have an audience for that. Nobody's going to want to watch those guides because they already know everything. And that leads to my next point. A diverse set of players makes for better gameplay. The more different types of players you have in one raid allows for dynamic raids. That way you're not running into the same people all over and over again, the same type of people over and over again. And B, it could get you into really sketchy scenarios. Who knows if the guy with the Mosin that's level 3 just gets a lucky shot on you because he doesn't know that he needs to take cover, and so you're not expecting him to you're not expecting him to make a stupid play, and he gets the drop on you or something. And this was what makes the game interesting. And let's be honest, these casual players are also easier to kill. If you're constantly running up against guys that are in full meta gear, full in-game gear, it's going to get not fun. It's going to be the same thing over and over again. And going back to my original point of challenge versus progression, if you're constantly playing against the same person the same type of person over and over again, that's not a challenge. It just becomes repetitive. Casuals also are more than likely working, so they have the money to financially support the game. Now, I'm not saying those that spend more time into the game aren't, or they're lazy. I'm not saying anything like that. Speaking only from the casual point of view, The reason I only have a couple hours to play at night is because I work 9, 10 hours a day. So I have money, I have disposable income, and I can pay for things for the game. I can pay for cosmetics, I can pay for a subscription. I know they don't want to do those things, but just as an example, I can pay for the DLCs going on. Casuals aren't likely to cheat. They're they're not going to be so disavowed by the game that they're going to look to get cheats, or they're not going to sit there and play 8 hours so that they want the best gear, but they're dying so often. So it's like, okay, if I'm going to spend this much time, let me at least get a hack that's going to make my life easier. They're not going to do that. A casual that is disavowed by the game is simply just going to stop playing it. Now, we've talked a lot about this problem, the inherent problem of challenge versus progression in Tarkov, why this unfairly hurts casuals, with unfairly being a sensitive word by the community, and I totally understand where they're coming from. Now that I've laid out my entire position, I want to wrap up everything that we've talked about in one conclusion and then move on to a couple solutions that I think could help. Tarkov is a great game, but I believe its design leads to a problem of challenge versus progression. The amount of players at the highest end of progression will increase over time, and this will unfairly affect new players and especially casual players if not challenged properly. The game does have some ways to not make this problem overly exaggerated, that being quests, the community itself helping newer players, the concept of harder maps such as labs, new maps coming forward, and different DLCs. However, this problem does hurt casuals disproportionately. And the reason why I think this is important is because casuals are a critical factor to the long-term success of the game. They keep the game alive, they can financially support it going forward if you can hook them and get them addicted to your game. So in conclusion, the major symptom of challenge versus progression problem is turning away new casual players, which can negatively affect the longevity of the game. That is my essential hypothesis of what I'm trying to push forward with this video. Now, I do want to propose a solution, as well as mention the ways the game is already helping mediate this problem right now. I think there are two kinds of solutions that we could work with. We can either treat the symptom of the core problem, that being that casuals are being turned away from the game or could be turned away from the game, as well as new players. The way the game is already doing this is through quests. Quests offer direction for new players, but also challenge more experienced players. The community comes together to provide resources for these new players and to add motivation for them to keep going, as well as actual game mechanics such as the scav raid. The scav raid allows you to increase your stash value, get better weapons to fuel your PMC runs without actually risking any loot. These are good things to help mediate the problem of casuals being disproportionately affected by this core problem of challenge versus progression. Some things I think the game could do or could utilize to help mediate this symptom as well could be playing around with the idea of tutorials, whether that be tutorial quests or raids. Maybe you can go into offline mode to complete the tutorial quests. That way you're learning the map, but you're also progressing at the same time. Again, this is just mediating the problem. I think offline mode could be tinkered with a little bit. I don't think gear should be able to be brought out of offline mode, but there's some things you could do in terms of experience and learning the map that it's not as simple as I'm just going to load into an offline mode and peter patter around. The only way I think to treat the core problem that is inherent to Escape from Tarkov of this challenge versus progression dynamic is introduce some sort of matchmaking dynamic into the game. Now, I know everybody listening that are super fanboys of the game just was shocked that I said the word matchmaking. I know this is an idea that has been shot down many times and nobody wants it. I don't think the development team of BSG wants it either. And to an extent, I completely agree. However, what I'm proposing is not a strict matchmaking system such as MMR that you see in CS:GO or Overwatch games like that. Those have a very strict competitiveness to their game. Escape from Tarkov is competitive, but it's also just a challenging, brutal game at its core. It doesn't have separate sections. It is one game of you go in, you survive, or you don't. That's it. So I don't think you would want to implement some sort of hard stop of matchmaking, being that only level 5s play against each other, or only groups play against each other, only solos play against each other. I don't think any of that will do anything because I do believe the randomness of the game is what makes it great. However, in order to alleviate a little bit of this problem, the matchmaking light version that I would think of will challenge better players more. You're challenged when you play against harder enemies in the game, whether that be the raiders, the AI raiders, or even AI bosses, the scav bosses, as well as better players in the game. I think the best way to do this is through level, because once you get into the highest level, you clearly know what you're doing, and you haven't been turned off by the game as well. Now, and I wouldn't want the solution to be only level 10 through 20 play against each other, only level 25 to 30 play against each other. Nothing like that. Because again, the randomness is what makes this game really fun. You also have to factor in queue times and how long it takes to get into a match. Right now it's first come first serve. I think that's fine. I think you could add some upper and lower bounds to it, and I think you can make that variable per raid, meaning that not every raid you load into is going to have an upper bound or lower bound on the levels that you could face. It could be random. It could be there's a 50% chance you're going to load in with only levels 10 to 20 if you're in between there, right? Or you could load in with anybody. Now, I'm not sure how the design of that would actually work. Maybe it is a bad algorithm to function and it would actually just lead to larger queue times. But this is what's going to allow the core game to still feel challenging to higher end players. But I do also want to maintain the integrity of the game, being that you could face anybody. So I'm not against a level 1 player getting shit on by a level 60 player over and over again. I do think that mediating that a little bit and adding some bounds to it that could happen randomly could actually act to facilitate better challenge at the higher end. So in general, I think some sort of matchmaking light system could actually really benefit the game. It needs to be tinkered with and it needs to be very precise. That way the highest level players aren't constantly facing against higher level players, because then it just gets repetitive over and over again if you're constantly fighting people with the best gear, the most meta gear, and whatnot. The reason why I think that this is going to be really hard to do is because the sensitive nature of that sort of matchmaking system. If it's too strict, you're not going to be able, you're going to have such long queue times that everybody's going to be disaffected. It's not strict enough, you're not going to see any sort of output. Again, all I'm trying to do is maybe change a little bit of the core functionality of the game based on who you load into the match with, not necessarily the actual raid or content itself. That I think will challenge better players more rather than them possibly running in and constantly just shitting on lower geared players. So in conclusion, I do think Tarkov is an amazing game, but it does have this one inherent flaw of not being challenging the farther and farther you progress, especially after multiple wipes. I don't think that this problem is necessarily so prevalent that it's seen in every single raid or it's seen by every single player. I do think the game does challenge you, just not to the level you think it would over time. There are plenty of things in the game already that are challenging, but at the end of the day, the more time you put in it, the more you learn about it, the game gets easier and there's no challenge to match that. In my opinion, to the same extent at which you're more, for lack of a better word, just better at the game. I do think this can be remediated primarily by the community. Guides and solutioning made by the community to help newer players, more casual players, are a great asset that this game brings, as well as a little push from the developers. I think that would go a long way just to help mitigate this problem so that it doesn't grow and grow and grow so that it ends up being the downfall of this game. In general, this is just my opinion of what I think this problem means for the game and its long term success. Obviously, I could be wrong. I don't have nearly as amount of the hours as a lot of the player base does. So if you feel that I'm wrong or that I misspoke or I've got something wrong in this video, please leave a comment below. If you like this type of video and you want to see more of it from us, leave a like as well. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more from us in the future. Sunrise Gaming is streaming again. We've been streaming a lot of Deep Rock Galactic. We really like that game, as well as going to tamper with a bunch of other games. So thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.